All right, welcome back to another edition of We Rise Fighting Labor podcast. We bring you today's labor news, history, and analysis from the U.S. and around the world. This is a podcast you listen to with your fellow workers organizing on the shop floor. This is a podcast you listen to before walking into your union meeting. As always, I am Rico Rutia here with my co-host Brian, and this week we bring you updates on labor news. Going to talk about French workers, Caterpillar workers, education workers in California, and much more, so please stay tuned.
El pueblo unido jamás será vencido.
El pueblo unido jamás será vencido. El pueblo unido jamás será vencido. El pueblo unido jamás será vencido.
De pie cantar que vamos a triunfar. Avanzan ya banderas de unidad y tú vendrás marchando junto a mí y así verás tu canto y tu bandera florecer. La luz de un rojo amanecer anuncia ya la vida que vendrá. De pie marchar el pueblo va a triunfar. Será mejor la vida que vendrá a conquistar nuestra felicidad y en un clamor mil voces de combate se alzarán, dirán canción de libertad con decisión la patria vencerá.
All right, welcome back, everyone, to tonight's edition of We Rise Fighting Labor podcast. Our first bit of news is coming from Euronews.com. The headline reads, 10,000 tons of uncollected trash in Paris as unions call for more action against pension reforms. All right, so in Paris, there's an estimated 10,000 tons of uncollected trash piling up in the streets of the French capital as unions call for more weekend protests and strike action against controversial pension austerity. Now, to be clear, last week, the French government used Article 49.3 of the Constitution, meaning they bypassed Parliament in order to impose extending the retirement age from 62 years to 64 years of age. And last March 7th was the biggest demonstration in France since the general strike of 1995, with around 2 million people in the streets of France. And to give people here in the U.S. a sense of what that's like, the U.S. has 5 times the population of France. So that would be like having 10 million people on the streets in the U.S., okay? So French opposition parties have now submitted a no-confidence motion in an attempt to topple Macron's government over his pension reform. Unions have called for more localized protests over the weekend, with strikes are already planned for next week. So now on the flight front, flight cancellations are expected with up to 30% of flights at Paris Orly Airport and 20% of flights at Marseille Provence Airport disrupted by the air traffic controllers' strike. SNCF railway unions have called for industrial actions to continue, with widespread cancellations anticipated next Thursday on long-distance train routes and on the Paris metro, while suburban rail journeys in Paris are already affected by strikes this weekend. Oil refineries have started to close down since Saturday as employees of Total Energies go on strike, actions which could eventually hit petrol pumps around the country. Unions representing electricity and gas workers have decided to strike next week as well, calling for, quote unquote, the maximum disruption of work. On the Port de Le Havre, officers and sailors who operate tugboats stayed on shore Friday, considerably disrupting all activity on the port, with container ships, LNG carriers, and oil tankers not able to enter or leave the harbor. In Calais, ferry traffic to the UK was completely stopped on Friday morning. Now, this is all going on in France right now, again, to keep it real simple, because the government essentially forced the retirement age from 62 years of age to 64 years of age. So there's been this massive upheaval, and we're watching it. And we're reporting on this because, as usual, we report on international affairs and the international workers movement, but because we need to take note of stuff like this. You know, we almost had a railway strike in the United States. Well, you know, when you look at other struggles in other nations of other railway workers or just other workers in general, you can see what the struggle looks like and what to expect. and what could happen here in the US if we engage in similar struggles and similar victories, I should say. So that's where we're keeping you on top of this news of what's going on in France and in Europe. We've been doing this for weeks now. It's very exciting. We hope that some of this energy, some of this labor class anger spills over into the US. Up next, we got Brian with some news on higher ed. So what's going on in higher ed, Brian?
All right, thanks, Rick. We send our salutes to the French workers and other workers of various nationalities in France. The descriptions that Rick reported, we wish them well in their strikes, and we send solidarity from this country. A new era of union activism in higher education has been happening in the last year in particular. It's been going on for some time, but it's increased. There's an article with James B. Thielen writing in Inside Higher Ed, March 15th, 2023. Thielen reports that all told, about 60% of the nearly 225,000 employees who engaged in work stoppages last year were educators, researchers, and other academic professionals. He goes on to report that strikes in the last year at the University of Illinois, at Chicago, and the University of California took place. And graduate students voted to unionize at numerous locations, including the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. It's about 5,000 there, and Clark and Fordham universities in early 2022. And graduate students scored high union representation wins at Boston and Yale universities. Other universities around the country, Indiana University, the University of Texas, Florida State University, the University of Chicago, and Johns Hopkins University among them, are seeing various types of collective action by their graduate students, including protest rallies and grade-ins, reports Thielen. That brings us to Florida, and listeners, what our brother Rick reported here tonight in Florida. What we're seeing is a scorched earth campaign being waged by the governor, Ron DeSantis. It's similar to what happened and took place in Wisconsin in 2011, and subsequently since then. In 2015, right to work was also passed in Wisconsin. In 2011, Wisconsin collective bargaining for public sector workers was essentially wiped out. DeSantis is attempting to take this to a whole new level in Florida. As we've seen in the news, this is happening across the country, but DeSantis is taking the lead. He's running for president in 2024, attacking Black studies programs, attacking LGBTQ communities and books representing and by that community, and a whole host of other activities. But also, similar to Wisconsin, a primary attack in all of this is the working class, and in particular our organizational vehicles such as unions. Just this past week, a professor at a Catholic university in Florida was fired for teaching Black studies, and he claimed that he was teaching Dr. Martin Luther King's studies, and of course Dr. King was a Christian, and the university administration capitulated and fired him, and he is fighting that legally. But this case needs to be taken up, because this is the type of activity we're going to be seeing by DeSantis and those who capitulate without intervention by the working class, and specifically by unions, which is the greatest organizational vehicle we have in this country to fight the bankers and the bosses and their political servants, is unions. So working class intervention is needed in Florida, and we're calling for this at Tallahassee at the state capitol. Many unions are engaging in parliamentary responses, having lobby days, etc., which is an organizing tactic that can be used. But as we saw in Wisconsin with Act 10 and subsequent austerity in that state, this will be nowhere near enough to stop the juggernaut that has begun in this country, and especially with somebody like DeSantis who has fascist tendencies. Parliamentary procedures and press conferences will not be enough to stop or slow down DeSantis and those like him. Education unions, with their membership and resources, hold vast power to engage in direct actions in alliance with multinational organizations defending Black and other multinational studies, the LGBTQ community and immigrant communities, and progressive faith-based organizations and other unions. So similar, Rick reported on what's happening in France, and we previously reported on in the UK in particular, where millions of workers have been engaged in strikes in the last few months. What's needed is the same thing in Florida, a mass-based national emergency mobilization, and soon. DeSantis not only wants to do this in Florida, but as running for president in 2024, he's looking to have this as a model federally and nationwide. So looking to France and the UK workers' strikes for inspiration, but also for concrete models of direct action organizing. And what we're talking about is we're talking going to Tallahassee and setting up shop with occupations, direct action, strikes. And if these legislators, these politicians are passing laws and they own corporations, community organizations could set up people's pickets at their locations to stop profits from coming in. Highways could be disrupted. Many different things that are happening in Latin America against austerity, many of the things happening in France and the UK could take place in Tallahassee and all over the state of Florida today. It could start this week. So we encourage our listeners there and we send them solidarity. We know there's heavy situations going down there, but we hope to join you in the struggles as they move forward. We look forward to hearing more about what unions and other community organizations are doing in Florida to fight back. Okay, Rick, you're going to talk about the bank collapse and the filthy bankers.
All right. Yeah, once in a while, the U.S. working class is treated to the spectacle of watching an industry being bailed out. We can go back to 1980. With the Chrysler Corporation bailout, $1.5 billion. In 1989, the savings and loan crisis, $124 billion. 2001, the airline industry bailout, $15 billion. 2008, the bank bailout, $700 billion. 2020, coronavirus airline bailout, $25 billion, and so on and so forth. So once in a while, we're treated to that. We scratch our heads. And to me, this brings to question capitalism itself. If capitalism is repeatedly having these crises and we have to bail it out, what good is it? How is it serving anyone? So I wanted to report on the SVC bank collapse because I think it should be a source of class anger. This is yet another industry that could potentially be bailed out again, as people are hurting right now. People are living paycheck to paycheck, if that. People are facing housing insecurity, rising rent prices, rising costs of living, and we may see another bailout. I hope we don't. Usually on a typical day, a shareholder or a CEO will tell you that they want the government to be hands off of business, laissez-faire, invisible hand, market forces of supply and demand, just leading the way. But when a collapse happens, when something goes wrong, that is when they turn to the state and they go crying and they want us to clean up the mess. And so here we are trying to understand what they did this time around. So decided to get into it just a little bit as best as I could today in preparation for today's podcast. Read a few articles, and I'm going to report on that. I managed to catch an article from the New York Times, from NPR, and The Guardian. To be quite honest and transparent, the New York Times article referenced a quote-unquote person close to the matter as one of their sources of information, so I dropped that article. I typically don't trust articles that say a person close to the matter, because after you say something like that, after you say a source like that, you can say anything. So New York Times, I let you go, and I just wanted to put that out there for critical thought and analysis when people go through the news. But as far as a little bit more substance, and NPR came back telling us this, that SVC as a bank grew really quickly. Its deposit base tripled between 2020 and 2022, with billions and billions of dollars flowing in. A lot of those billions had come from all the risks the bank took while lending money to startups and companies that couldn't get loans at other banks. And those risks paid off. And Silicon Valley Bank took all of those billions it earned from taking those risks and stowed them in what is supposed to be the least risky investment of all, in U.S. government bonds. Silicon Valley Bank locked billions of dollars away into 10-year government bonds, but there were risks it wasn't seeing. And this is where I'm going to pick up with the Guardian article. Guardian reports this: SVC had benefited for more than a decade of quote-unquote zero money interest rates as billions poured into the bank via tech venture capital. Looking for some kind of return, it put the money into long-term U.S. Treasury bonds. But when interest rates started sharply rising last year and depositors demanded higher returns, the bank was forced to sell some of those bonds at a loss. When news of that hit social media, tech investors panicked triggering a classic bank run. From there, it took 36 hours for the second biggest bank failure in US history to materialize. Okay, let's pause there for a second. Tech investors panicked. All right, I just want to highlight that for a second, because that speaks to this situation, and it also speaks to the stock market and Wall Street in general. Why are we at the mercy of anyone's panic? Why is the economy at the mercy of anyone's panic? Why are we at the mercy of the speculation of shareholders, capitalists, at the mass psychology of panic? Why is our economy subject to this? Those aren't market forces, man. Why are we, again, entire industries at risk because of the speculation, panic, and recklessness of shareholders and CEOs? So we started off today's podcast by talking about what was going on in France because we want to put some tools in the minds and in the unions of the US working class so we can start fighting back and not just have to watch stuff like this go down and scratch our heads and swallow our class anger each and every time. In 1980, 1989, in 2001, in 2008, in 2020, all these bailouts each and every single time, we haven't waged enough of a struggle against it. But meanwhile, right now, French workers are showing us how to wage a struggle against austerity measures, against increasing the retirement age, against authoritarian measures on behalf of capital. So I just wanted to highlight the fact that that's why we're reporting on the French workers' struggle. That's why we're reporting on this happening with Silicon Valley Bank, just because, it's something that we should consider as part of our struggle. So we say bail out the people, not the banks. And up next, as far as more news, more labor news, we have Brian with some news from the fast food industry. What's going on there, Brian?
Thanks, Rick. And appreciate your report there on the banks. Back about a little over 10 years ago, just raising this for our listeners if they want to do some research as well before I get into the fast food workers, that Detroit had a bankruptcy and the pensioners, their money was stolen, and that the Moratorium Now Coalition and the retirees fight back of the Moratorium Now Coalition group, they fought back against the bankruptcy. They won some concessions, but there's a variety of different information on their website and Facebook page about that. And it was quite a fight there in Detroit, and I think listeners might be interested in some of that information. So thanks a lot, Rick. Fast food workers, ride hail drivers, and nail technicians are fighting for new forms of labor organizing. From a March 13th Fast Company article. This article describes some various different kinds of organizing discussions that are taking place with these workers in these various industries and or sectors about sectoral bargaining, where workers in an entire industry negotiate as a whole, is common in Europe. And the article details worker organizers trying to make it work in the US. And the article details fast food workers, ride hail drivers, and nail technicians, but it could be applied to a whole variety of others, such as the coffee workers organizing and many, many others. So we just wanted to raise that today in brief. We'll be having more information about this in the future, as well as there's a whole variety of very creative and courageous organizing going on with these types of workers in the US today. All right, Rick, we're going to Los Angeles. School workers strike.
All right, yeah. SCIU school workers strike in Los Angeles. Thousands of cafeteria workers, bus drivers, custodians, special education assistants, and other essential school workers in the Los Angeles United School District, LAUSD, announced that it would lead a 3-day strike from Tuesday, March 21st through Thursday, March 23rd to protest the school district's unfair practices. During a spirited rally on Wednesday, March 15th, United Teachers Los Angeles, the union representing over 30,000 teachers at LAUSD, announced that it would honor the strike and not cross the picket line set up by school workers. Workers are calling attention to how the district's over-reliance on a low-wage, part-time workforce is impacting local communities and the quality of student services. The average salary of school workers at LAUSD, this is Los Angeles, is $25,000 a year, and most work part-time hours, making it difficult to retain and recruit sufficient staff for student services. This is leading to serious staffing shortages, including insufficient teacher assistants, substandard cleaning and disinfecting at schools, jeopardizing campus safety due to overloaded campus aides and playground supervisors, and limited enrichment after school and parental engagement programs. For more information on how you can support the strike, you can visit SEIU, that's SEIU for Service Employees International Union, the number 99.org, SEIU99.org. Also in the news, Caterpillar union workers vote in favor of a 6-year labor agreement. So, update from Caterpillar negotiations. UAW members ratified a contract with Caterpillar on March 12th, effective immediately. This, in effect, calls off what would have been a strike at the world's largest manufacturer of construction and mining equipment. A strike at Caterpillar would have followed in the footsteps of the strikes carried out by workers against John Deere and CNH Industrial in the last couple of years. The contract covers roughly 7,000 union workers at plants in central Illinois and a parts distribution center in York, Pennsylvania. For more details, you can visit the UAW Region 4 or the UAW Local 751 website. That's all the news that we have for tonight. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. We will be back again with you soon. Have a good night, everyone. Love and solidarity to all.